So in this video, I'm going to go over representative sampling, or what does it mean to have a sample that's representative. Now this connects to the previous video I completed on the whiteboard, but let me go into more detail, right? So in your text, they talk about non-probability and probability sampling. Now, for you all, you've probably heard about random sampling and all these other terms that are related to what we're going to go over. So just keep in mind, try to connect those terms to what you're learning here and make sure you understand what we're discussing. And if you have questions at any point, please reach out to me. So non-probability is a sample where you did not random sample from the population of interest, meaning you recruited participants in a way that was not random, right? So because of that, this sample is not representative of the population of interest, meaning your sample doesn't look like that population you're interested in studying, right? You're hoping that you can take these findings from the small sample and generalize those to the entire population. If you're studying university students, you're hoping that your findings from this study will apply to all university students. Or maybe you're thinking adults, right? If you have a non-probability sample, then you can't really do that. A probability sample means that every person in that population of interest had an opportunity of being selected for your study or recruited, right? So in that situation, your sample is representative of the population of interest. It looks like the population of interest. You can take the findings from that small study with less people in the population of interest, right? Because it would take a tremendous amount of resources to recruit everybody in the population of interest. You can generalize those findings from this probability sample to the population of interest, right? So let me say that again. If you have a probability sample, you can generalize your findings to the population of interest. If you have a non-probability sample, you cannot. Non-probability is non-representative of the population of interest. A probability sample is representative of the population of interest. Know that non-probability is the same thing as non-representative, and probability is the same thing as representative. We're going to use those interchangeably, right? And I'm going to use those terms interchangeably in your exam as well. So know that they're the same thing. So here, let me go over an example. Similar to the previous example, but a little different. In this example, there's a population, like a bug or something, but there's a population that you're looking at. Now take a moment, look at this population and consider, who do you think we're studying? What is a population of interest? Try to define it. Remember, a population in psychological research and in research in general is not the same thing as everybody in the US, like the population of the US, the population of the world. Not the same thing. When we say population, we're referring to population of interest. So in this case, what could you imagine we're studying? What's the population of interest? Not what, who, right? Kind of doing that Dora thing again. Yes, ideally, you're thinking, okay, something like sports. We're interested in studying people who do sports, something like that, right? So in this case, that would be the population of interest. We're interested in people who do sports. But let's say our sample looked like this. We only have people who do motocross. And we're interested in studying how does being involved in sports, how does it impact health? If we did a study with only people in motocross, we might determine, well, it looks like people who do sports are more likely to get bone injuries and break a bone, right? Because you could imagine motocross, sometimes a machine falls on you, sometimes you fall off, sometimes you get hit, so bones are breaking. Now, will those findings apply to everybody that does sports? No, right? because here this might be a more dangerous sport than walking, for example. So in this case, the findings from this sample about injuries would not generalize to the population of interest. Now, let's say my population of interest was motocross, people who do motocross, and that's fine, right? You could decide, well, I don't want to study people who do sports. I want to specifically study people who do motocross. And now let's say these different colors, instead of representing different sports, they represent different age groups, right? So different age groups that do motocross. So now let's take a look at our sample. Now, in this case, this is what a probability sample would look like. You have people of all age groups, right? Because you want to make sure you represent everybody in your population of interest in your sample. So you have to kind of think of key demographics, making sure you're sampling. You should get a good mix of gender, age groups, depending on the population of interest, right? Motocross, you might, actually I don't know the gender breakdown, right? But you might get more males if it's male dominated. But your sample should be representative of the population of interest. In this case, just focusing on age looks good. Now let's say you had this instead. Well, it looks like, let's say these were older motocross riders, people in their 50s to 60s. Now, let's say I'm looking at injuries among this group, and I find, well, it looks like people are likely to get hip displacements, hip injuries. They're likely to throw out their back. And I find all these consequences of motocross that relate to older age. Now, let's say I want to generalize these findings to the population of interest. Well, careful, you might throw out your back, I'm telling the 18-year-old. And, well, that's not going to be the case most likely. They might injure their back, but probably not just throw out their back, and probably aren't as susceptible to injury as older riders. So hopefully you can see how, in this case, if this was my sample, I couldn't take those findings and apply them to my population of interest. So in other words, my findings are not generalizable.